My name's Kari Woo, and I'm a jewelry designer and mixed media artist located in Cochrane, Alberta. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in specializing in jewelry and metalsmithing from AU Arts in Calgary. I did do a number of years of self kind of learned work before I went and did my BFA, so about 5 years of kind of just short coursework and experimenting kind of on my own time. My biggest inspirations probably come from patterns in nature and observation around those things, as well as I really appreciate the contrast between urban elements and nature. So kind of contrast between urban architecture and natural textures. So I'll work both of those things into one piece. Absolutely, I see myself as part of a community. Probably the biggest one is just the fine craft community in general across Canada. There's a certain dialogue that we can have together and advocacy we can work towards together. A lot of the people that I went to school with became my professional colleagues and peers once we left school. So I've done a lot of collaborative work with those folks. And, I think also I'm a member of the Craft Council of British Columbia, of course, as well as the Alberta Craft Council and other national organizations, as well as international, to do particularly with my craft. And so I think all of those kind of associations and connections are important and, play different roles. Yeah. Yes, but also challenge. Being trained here in Canada, especially, I'm in this kind of hybrid area between being a fine craft artist as well as a goldsmith. And so because I did my Bachelor of Fine Arts, I didn't go to a technical goldsmithing school, although I do make my living as a jewelry designer. So in one way, I loved my education because there was freedom and flexibility, but it wasn't necessarily rooted in one tradition. And so once I came out of school and started to work more in the goldsmithing arena, making my living as a jewelry designer and studio jeweler, I found it quite challenging because I didn't have that traditional background. And so I've befriended, I've befriended goldsmiths that have more traditional training and background, and I've gleaned a lot of really amazing knowledge from them. But at the same time, it's very interesting because they'll look at me and go, "Oh, you're so creative," or "You're, that I would never do it that way." And so I think that's where the art school kind of angle comes in terms of maybe innovative thought, or maybe not being rooted in a tradition. It gives me more flexibility in terms of the way I think about things to some degree. So yes and no, and then of course, traditional knowledge in terms of family and cultural tradition plays a big part in the work that I do. And so I have part of my family, my dad's side of the family, they were first generation to immigrate to Canada. My dad was. And so he's a little more traditional than my mom, who's, the second or third generation born in Canada. My ancestry is from China. And so a lot of my work, especially the work in the Personal Material Geographies exhibition, has to do with kind of, figuring out how those influence me in terms of identity and my sense of place in the world. Well, I'm definitely not an early adopter. I'm always quite skeptical about things. I did spend a period of time living in a cabin completely off-grid, like no electricity or running water, for a couple of years in my early 20s. And that was an amazing and very impactful experience. And so, I'm always skeptical about technology, but it's also helped a lot. And so of course, social media and being able to sell online has changed the practice of all artists across the world. And I really appreciate that, especially now in the time of COVID. And I've also recently adopted doing online consultations with people, which I never used to do before, but because of COVID, it kind of arose through COVID, but now that I've started them, they're way more convenient, because sometimes when I'm meeting with people, I'll spend an hour getting to meet them and then, spend an hour or whatever talking to them. And, you know, if my consultations are free for people or complimentary. And so sometimes those meetings don't end up going anywhere. And so it's a lot of time and effort and use of energy on a lot of levels. So that's been great. In terms of technology in making my work, I'm more of a hands-on person. I've found ways to integrate different technologies, you know, like laser printing paper to use in texturing my metal, or I've done a little bit of 3D printing, but that's mostly been for commission work. I haven't integrated that into my practice at all because I just love working with the material so much. I have been thinking about laser cutting some wood to kind of integrate. So I've seen jewelry designers that do laser cut wood, like, and that's the main part of their piece. And so, you know, for me who love my hands on the material, like I could see getting elements cut and then integrating those kind of thing. And I have worked on public art projects where I did have laser cutting done on a big plaque of wood as part of one of the pieces that I did for this installation. And so that was super helpful. And there's just no way I could have accomplished that effect by hand, right? So it definitely has its place, and I'm not totally closed. Like I'm not a purist, but or traditionalist, but I'm also, yeah, like I said, not an early adopter usually. Well, in terms of the community, say of my family, earliest community experience, you know, that I had a lot of kind of traditional values instilled in me. And even though my family isn't super traditional, they've affected, you know, the things that I think about in terms of identity and sense of place and home. And I've investigated my family's migration story to a pretty great extent in terms of some of my visual art work, my fine craft work. And that definitely plays an impact. I mean, my earliest art training was also in traditional Chinese watercolor, which I think has a really big, or had a really big impact on the aesthetic of my work, because, you know, that style of painting is very minimalist and it has a lot of negative and space that plays, you know, inside the frame. And so I see that influence in terms of my design aesthetic. You know, and then in terms of the community coming up as an artist, as I mentioned earlier, I lived on the west coast of British Columbia for a couple of years on Haida Gwaii. And that was the first place I really felt embraced as an artist. And I remember walking into this gathering of folks when I first arrived, and they're like, "Oh, you're an artist." And I had never up to that point referred to myself as an artist and yet. And so that was really a big deal for me. And so it was a very nurturing time. I call it kind of my creative incubator time. So that was really important. And I just had it was before I went to art school. I just experimented with all sorts of materials. I was already making jewelry. And so that was huge. And without that chapter, I'm not sure where I would have ended up, because once I came back to Alberta after that, it kind of set me on the path of kind of pursuing my education. And then I've been in the craft and jewelry arena ever since. And then going to school at the Alberta University of the Arts, formerly ACAD. I mean, that was huge. The learning environment and being amongst peers that are, you know, you're learning that stuff with them, alongside them. And there's no replacing that kind of experience together. And so there's a real bond. And, you know, some of my best friends to this day in the sector, definitely people that I met through school, right? So you grow together and you fail together and, you know, you succeed together. So yeah, it was great. So all of those communities have had a huge impact on myself. So, and I really like being in community. I'm not really a hermit. I mean, I don't think I'm extrovert, but I'm not a hermit. And so, you know, you need people, and I think we're stronger together than apart. The raw materiality of BC was definitely where I first started experimenting with mixed media work. So when I lived on Haida Gwaii, I lived in this little cabin that was right across this, you know, one lane highway from the ocean, basically the east coast of the island. And I mean, that is just like as raw as you can get, really, like living right on the coast. And being a girl from the Rockies, you know, I live on the east side of the Rockies, you know, was born on the east side of the Rockies. I'd never experienced wind, number one. And then just the changeability of that landscape, like the tide line's always changing, and, you know, the wind impacting, you know, the tides, and then the high tide and low tide. I mean, it was amazing. And so the beachcombing was just unbelievable, right? Like just walking down that beach every day, finding different materials. So I used to kind of pick things up and I would just start responding to them. And sometimes they were natural objects, but not always. Like one time I found a set of copper pipes that had this amazing natural patina on them from, you know, being out in the salt water and the sun and just with all that exposure to the wind. And so, you know, that influence has impacted my aesthetic to this day. You know, like the mixed media work that I do, I really attribute to developing in that time of my life. And so of course, now being back in Alberta, it's a different landscape. Absolutely. It's the one I was born in. So I feel much more kin to it in a lot of ways. But a lot of my inspiration comes from the time that I spend outside and observing and just kind of, yeah, being close to the earth. So that has a big impact. I think so, absolutely. So, I mean, particularly West Coast. So, you know, maybe not, I'm not so sure about like interior British Columbia. There probably, people would argue that there was, you know, a distinct kind of BC aesthetic even from that point. But yeah, a lot of my friends who live in BC, you can see, you know, the influence of just the ecosystem that they live in, right? Like whether it's cedar or cedar bark textures, or, you know, I have one jewelry friend who she casts a lot of like tree cones and branches and such. And so, you know, those are definitely in response to where she's living. And so, you know, and I think as artists, you can't help but respond to the world around you, and especially the immediate world around you. And so, I mean, the West Coast in particular, but BC in general, it's so rich and diverse. I mean, it's just amazing, like the wildlife and salmon and bears. And so, you know, I feel like I'm still definitely influenced by that aesthetic, but, you know, not as much as I live there still, so. Well, the work that I have in the Personal Materials Geography exhibition, it is a continuation of a series I've been working on for close to 20 years. But it's the first time that I've branched out into looking at my maternal lineage. So that, you know, most of the women in there are from my mom's side of the family. And yeah, I just really wanted to pay kind of respects and homage to them and how hard they worked to, you know, allows me to kind of be the person that I am today. And so I really also appreciated the content of that exhibition. I think it was a really interesting topic that the Craft Council of British Columbia came up with. And I'm sorry I won't be able to see it myself, but it sounds like a really exciting and diverse group of people that are exhibiting in it. And it's the first time. I usually don't make wearable pieces in terms of my mixed media work. So I did depart from my regular way of working in my mixed media kind of realm. So it's the first time I've merged my mixed media and my jewelry design together. So that was really fun to be part of.